My job here is to tell you that it's not as difficult as some folks make it to be. So this here is the latest book that I've published. This is my 8th book. This one right here, The History of the United Supreme Council, Ancient Accepted Scottish Rite, Northern Jurisdiction. And this is very unusual because, as Black Hall knows, I'm from the Southern Jurisdiction. I was invited, I think, back in 1995 by the Sovereign Grand Commander when the Southern Jurisdiction met in Florida. And, of course, the members of the Northern Jurisdiction, their staff, came down to Florida, and the Sovereign Grand Commander, Brogdon is his name, summons me to come to his suite. And he requested that, that a contract be drawn up and that I write the history of the Northern Jurisdiction. It's not that difficult. The main thing about writing, of course, is trying to find those documents. As some of you here, we got a lot of grand historians here, and you know how difficult that is to do with in Prince Hall Freemasonry, finding those documents. But the documents are there. So I've got a prepared text. I will read this, and I will at times interject some personal comments of things. And then we're going to take a look at this book, a couple of items in this book, because I have a letter here from the Supreme Council of the Southern Jurisdiction, who call themselves the Mother, they call themselves the Mother Supreme Council of the world. And I have always, in my books, I've always stated so-called, because they're not the Mother Supreme Council to my Supreme Council. So they don't particularly like that. But anyway, they did send a little note in about this book. And so I'm going to read this prepared text, and then we'll get into this thing. First of all, as I stated earlier, I do want to thank each of you for supporting the Flaxus Foundation by attending this special workshop on writing, the walk style. The idea for this special workshop was recommended by Brother James Allen. The Flaxus Foundation raises funds in support of its annual writing contest, which allows it to award funds for those who submit papers that are found worthy. Last year we had 2 such papers. Both received a check, as I stated a while ago. And the papers are to be published in the Flaxus magazine. One of those are in this latest issue of the Flaxus magazine, and it deals with the Grand Lodge of the Prince Hall side, the Grand Lodge of Florida. Now, of interest here, the name of the Grand Lodge of Florida is Union Grand Lodge. There is a Prince Hall Grand Lodge in Florida, and we don't recognize that body. And the two split from each other. And so the fellow that wrote this paper and won this $100 prize explains to you exactly what happened. And it's typical. It was a case of a Grand Master abusing his authority, a Grand Master who was dictatorial. And the members got fed up with it and split. And so we have two Grand Lodges there, really both from the same source, but one who's called Prince Hall Grand Lodge, we don't recognize. And so we recognize the Union Grand Lodge. My latest book, this one here, this baby here, is the 8th of my books. And I hope many of you will read it. You have to write to the United Supreme Council of Northern Jurisdiction to get the book. I did bring a couple that I had, and I sold them all, and I just don't have any more. But you have to get it, and it costs $30. And the Northern Jurisdiction is the one that's selling this stuff. I hope that those of you who get the opportunity to read this book will find it worthy, and worthy of some names. I'm going to give you some names here. Worthy of Harry E. Davis, who was the grand historian of the Northern Jurisdiction and wrote a book that is still being sold almost 50 years after he wrote it. And he dedicated it to his wife, and he was from Ohio. And he wrote the history of the Negro, the history of Masonry among Negroes in the United States. I believe that's close to the title. And of course, Harry A. Williamson, who this particular society is sort of dedicated to, if you will. He's the one that did so much for Prince Hall Freemasonry. His collection sits in the New York Public Library, the Schomburg Center for Research into Black Culture in Harlem. His collection is there. I have used that collection over the years. I continue to use that collection. I sent a team out there and microfilmed that whole collection, and I have all of it in my house on microfilm. My publishers did that for me. My publishers is McCoy Publishing in Richmond, Virginia. If you look on the inside of your back cover of your journal, you'll find the McCoy advertisement there. They always advertise in the Flaxus journal for us. And they are my publishers. They've published 2 of my works. That's Black Square and Compass, which is so many years old. I don't know how many years, but I continue to draw royalties, and I appreciate that. And they also published my Prince Hall quiz book. They have given the Flaxus Society permission to publish, correct, and publish Harry Williamson's Prince Hall Primer and Prince Hall Digest. I have the material. Some years ago, they asked me to update it. I updated it, and the lady, it's a lady that runs McCoy, by the way, she decided that because of Alan Roberts, some of you know him, was doing the Masonic Encyclopedia of Coyle out of Washington, who was very anti-Prince Hall. But because of the fact that they was preparing to publish this Masonic Encyclopedia, that they thought it would be better to hold back on the Williamson book, and then eventually I just wrote them and said, look, you're not doing anything with it. The Flaxus Society will publish it. And they agreed to it. They sent me a letter, and I sent a copy to Sid Breckenridge, who's director of our book department. And so somewhere down the line, we plan to publish in Kansas City. We plan to publish that book. And that book, my brothers, will be sold for a good 40 years, if not longer. Okay. And also, I hope that the book is worthy of Dr. Charles H. Wesley, who was, before his death, he was a member of this Flaxus Society, and he was the #1 African-American historian in the United States. And he wrote about fraternities, and he wrote everything there is about African-Americans. And Dr. Charles Wesley, his picture's out here on one of the Flaxus covers that's out here. Dr. Charles Wesley was, to me, the Masonic author. He's quite a man, quite a man. He was also Grand Prior of the United Supreme Council. A lot of folks don't know that, but he was Grand Prior of the Southern Jurisdiction, Prince Hall. And then I hope that the work is worthy of George W. Crawford. George W. Crawford was the Sovereign Grand Commander of the Northern Jurisdiction, and I have a chapter dedicated to him here in this book. George was from Connecticut. He was a brilliant lawyer, a brilliant lawyer. He was Sovereign Grand Commander when he was in his 80s, and he did so much. We talk about that cathedral that they have in Philadelphia. Well, he put it up there. He put it up there and saw that he got paid, that the funds, the mortgage, I guess you call it, the mortgage was paid within record time. Within record time, George did it. And one of the things about writing Masonic books, you get the opportunity, my brothers, to read what is called proceedings. The Order of the Eastern Stars and the Masonic bodies print proceedings every year, or they are supposed to. Some people say, no, we can't afford it this year. But you see, this is the only record that you have that you existed. And if they don't publish these proceedings, then as far as anybody else is concerned, maybe Grand Lodge, Grand Chapter died. And therefore, they should publish proceedings every year. And as far as the brothers are concerned, I can't talk for the sisters, but as far as the brothers are concerned, in the back of the proceedings should be a listing of all the lodge and all of the lodge members. And this is how we, as historians, go back and track folks. When we get to looking for people, this is where we go. We go to the proceedings to find these folks. And we try to find their lodge. We need their lodge. And we can track them. We can track them. One of the things that I've learned in writing is that if you was ever born in the United States, somebody can track you. Somebody can track you. In other words, you leave your footprints in the sands. And I don't care how old or how many years ago that person might have passed. You can track them. And those that are of the Masonic family, we track them through the proceedings, newspapers, and these type of things. And there's many libraries out there, Masonic libraries, that have our proceedings. And thank God, because we don't save them. We don't save them. When I wrote this book here, anytime I write a book, the first place I go is to the Iowa Masonic Library. They know me pretty well. I go there first. And then I'll branch out to the other Masonic libraries across the United States. And in writing this book, I went to Philadelphia, to the White Grand Lodge Masonic Library there. And the lady that brought me up in the shelves told me they don't allow nobody up in those shelves. And I was only the second person to go up in them shelves. That was Prince Hall. The other one was Harry Williamson over 40 years ago. So, and I was the second. In other words, they let me up there by myself. And I spent about an hour up there. And the young lady, PhD lady, I thanked her in this book. The New York Masonic Library, Livingston, Chancellor Livingston Masonic Library, also sent me material. I have no problems if George Green was here, who was our director of Masonic Hall of Fame. If he was here, he would tell you, we don't have any problems getting information on Prince Hall from the Caucasian side of the fence. From our side, we can't get it. We can't get it. So it's sad. It's a sad commentary. Anyway, I want to say that these fellows that I named, Harry Davis and Harry Williamson and Dr. Charles Wesley and George Crawford, these scholars set the stage for me. And I appreciate them. It's a beautiful thing to be able to track these individuals and know everything that they wrote, to have it in your hands. Doesn't matter what they wrote, everything that they ever wrote, you have it in your hands. You can find it. And it's like George Crawford. I call him the Oscar Wilde of Prince Hall Freemasonry. I sat down in the cathedral in Philadelphia reading his allocution. The allocution is what they call it. In the Grand Lodge, we call it Grand Master's Address. In Eastern Star's Grand Worthy Matron's Address. In the Scottish Rite, they call it allocution. And to read the words with this man, you could feel the beauty of his soul. When I say Oscar Wilde was the one person that had the command of the English language. His words are just beautiful, and words on paper are very meaningful to me. I shed tears sometimes. Words are so beautiful. And reading the allocutions of George Crawford, some of it's in this book. So I come before you as a, quote, Masonic historian, and of course Masonic history is made by people, by Freemasons whose courage and imaginations changed the course of universal Freemasonry. It is also the story of rebellion, of revolution against the establishment, of ruthless individuals at times, greedy for power, position, and in some cases wealth, of exploitation and tyranny, of the downtrodden and prosecuted, of bastards as well as heroes. This you'll find in most of my works, but especially in my history of the United Supreme Council, Northern Jurisdiction. I hope this will encourage you to go out and buy the book. I don't get any royalties from it, so, but go on and get the book. When I write history, I attempt to stress not only events, either good or bad, but those that touch the lives of Freemasons within our Prince Hall family. When I write my biographies of individuals, I try to tell the story of that one person and other people's effect on him. I try to remember at all times that people of the past were very much like myself. And I try to bring them as vividly to life as I possibly can. The reader will be able to identify with these brethren that I write about. And I wanted to stress that a casual approach to the writing of history is dangerous. For the most important criterion in the writing of history is accuracy. And if I can't leave you with anything else, there's only one word to tell you about writing, and that is verify, verify, verify. Don't leave anything to chance. If you put it on a piece of paper, make sure that it is the truth and that you can document it. Verify, verify, verify. Don't take nobody's words for nothing. Okay, this is one of the problems we have in Prince Hall Freemasonry, you know. Somebody says something, we take it to be the gospel, but that's not the way it works for a historian. You can't accept nothing unless you verify. Okay? A writer cannot write accurately unless he is willing to dig for the facts. Historical writings cannot be based upon clippings or quotations, but involves dedicated research, a weighing of evidence based on primary, and you say primary, my brothers, that is original, and secondary sources, and a considered interpretation of what one learns. Now, I'm good, as you will find in this book, and as in all my books, I am very liberal about my interpretation of events. And a lot of times this gets me in trouble, and I enjoy being in trouble because they jump on me and I get them off my back real fast. And I'm going to read you a letter from the White Supreme Council, and you'll see what I mean. But a writer must have integrity. He must cleave to accuracy of fact and detail, must be above prejudice, which is very difficult for me, by the way. As you will learn from a letter received from the White Supreme Council, what pleases me most stirs my imagination and enthusiasm and brings precious new life to my writing. It has been said every man has a right to his opinion. Sometimes some of my grandmasters don't believe I have a right for my opinions. But no man, and this is important, no man has a right to be wrong in his facts. Okay? I think that every writer should have a mentor, a writer that in fact teaches the craft through his own writings. As a Masonic history, I have always attempted to follow the paths laid out by Dr. Charles H. Wesley, FPS, Harry E. Davis, and Harry Williamson. These are my mentors, my Masonic mentors. Okay? These men were the greatest writers within Prince Hall Freemasonry, and today the Philaxis Society is the only one that honors them. However, in my case, the individual writer that in fact taught me to write was a man by the name of Kenneth Roberts. I have mentioned this before. Any of you who picked up the history of the shrine, you'll see it listed right there in my introduction about Kenneth Roberts. And I want to explain this to you. When I was a very young man, way before I joined the Army, I joined the Army at 17. My mother put me in the Army when I was 17. Get me off the streets of Brooklyn because I was heading for it. And I really would have ended up in Leavenworth, but not where I live at now. But anyway, When I was a very young man, I lived in a project in Brooklyn. It was called Fort Greene Project. The largest project, at the time, it was the largest project in the world, and it's still there. And I love that place. I wouldn't want to live there, but I love that place. And I was blessed that within this project was the Walt Whitman Public Library. I'll never forget that little library as long as I live. It was in that library where I discovered the writings and the novels of Kenneth Roberts. It has been over 50 years, but I can still remember the titles of some of his works. They were Lydia Bailey, Northwest Passage, Arundel, Rabble in Arms, The Lively Lady, Captain Cautious. I, of course, read these and other masters as well. But Kenneth Roberts was, to me, one of the greatest masters, and his writings, and especially the details within his work, have remained with me all of these years. We're talking over 50 years. I remember that I had a medical appointment and had to travel from Brooklyn into Manhattan, or New York City, to the hospital. And on the bus that I was traveling, when it stopped at one place, it stopped in front of a bookstore. And I remember looking out and looking into the window and seeing a book with the title of I Wanted to Write by Kenneth Roberts. I never read this book, but always wanted to read it, since it was written by my favorite author, and that was back in 1949. When I came to Leavenworth, Kansas, and decided to write Black Square and Compass, 200 Years of Prince Hall Freemasonry, I remembered that book. And I had some book finders in Washington, D.C., locate a copy of that book. And from this book, I actually learned the process of research and not allowing anything to be taken at face value without verification. I say these words again. Anyone who wants to write, verify, verify, verify. And you will find that through verification, that is the secret of success and the secret of writing. Verify, verify, verify. Since my writings is received by many within mainstream American Freemasonry, I am always amused when I see them picnic over this or that portion of my work. I well remember Colonel Harvey Newton Brown, who I haven't heard from in so many years, I presume he's passed. But Colonel Harvey Newton Brown was a Caucasian retired lieutenant colonel who lived in El Paso, Texas. And when I wrote Black Square and Compass, he went and got a copy of that book, and he had the audacity to criticize it. He wrote that I was writing and preaching black power. You know, this is the weirdest thing I ever heard of in my life. You know, the only thing I ever tried to do in Black Square and Compass was to bring some historical events that had taken place by Prince Hall Freemasons, because nowhere did I see these things, anywhere. In the many Masonic books that I used to buy, I never saw anything about Prince Hall and about individual Prince Hall Masons. Of course, the McCoy, who eventually ended up publishing that work, refused to accept the manuscript because I had some nasty things to say about George Washington. And the only thing I said about George Washington was the truth. I said he was a slaver. You know, he was a slave owner, and that's what he was. And they turned down my manuscript. They turned down my manuscript. So I did what any red-blooded American lad would do. I went down to my credit union, borrowed me some money, and published the book myself. Some of you got the small little soft cover copy of that book. And hey, that thing sold out overnight. I went back and got another loan, paid off that first loan, got another loan, and republished it a second time. And here comes the letter from McCoy. we'd be more than happy to publish your book. And well, I let them publish it because I had to get out of that distribution business. That distribution business enough to drive somebody crazy. And I allowed them to publish the book, and they've been paying me royalties ever since. Twice a year, I get a nice little check. So, and I appreciate it. But persistence also was the key to writing. Persistence. You have to hang in there. You know, if somebody turns your manuscript down, most people who go over manuscripts will tell you what's wrong with it. And you can take that and redo your manuscript if need be, if there's some corrections need to be. My problems as far as Black Square and Compass, and I particularly named it like that, was that here again, I'm a rather opinionated person. I call a spade a spade. I call a racist too. If you remember that, I have niggerdom and regalia in there. If you any of you read that book, you remember that one, niggerdom and regalia. Oh man, that thing came out, boy, it just hit the fan. You know, niggerdom and regalia. But I took that right out of the proceedings of the Prince Hall Grand Lodge in Missouri. Of course, I strengthened it a little bit, but it was letters between some so-called Masons in Mississippi concerning Prince Hall Lodge that was named after the first Black United States Senator in the United States, who was at one time living in Leavenworth, Kansas. So in response to the criticism of Colonel Brown and others with Black Square and Compass, I wrote that only a fool would use such words as Black Power, Masonry. And Masonic history cannot be defined in those terms. I had a good brother from Illinois, Alfonso Serza was his name. He had the nerve to write me and tell me that, hey, you and I got a lot in common. You're losing your hair up front, and I'm losing my hair. And both our parents come from overseas and all of this. And this man was just as blatant anti-Prince Hall as they can be. And I called him an idiot and a fool and a stupid person because he didn't know what he's talking about. Don't write the history of Black people if you don't know Black people. Simple as that. And that's what I told him. And from that time on, until his death, of course, he refused to accept any of my mail. It was interesting. I would write him, and the letter would come back, and he would write me, and I'd send his letter back with unopened, you know. And this went on for a little while, and I still call him an ass, and will always call him an ass. And if his family was here, I would tell them that I thought he was an ass. That's the way it is. We get in trouble with some of the words we use. I have made it quite clear that I strongly hold the views that whites cannot write about the Black experience in America, nor of Prince Hall Freemasonry. If you remember Alan Roberts, my good friend Alan Roberts of Richmond, Virginia, he wrote a book, and he took me to task about that. He says that anybody can write about a subject, you know. If you're a historian, you can write, but you can't write about Black people if you don't know Black people. If you ever walked in my shoes, how can you write about me? I can write about the white experience because I'm an African-American living in America and have trials and tribulations over the white experience or European experience. I can do that. But they can't write about us. They just can't do it. There are a lot of folks out there making money about us, but they can't write about us. In Black Square and Compass, I added a quote from Joseph A. Baldwin from the Journal of Black Psychology in 1979, and here's what I wrote. Given the multicultural nature of American society, we must be extremely cautious in interpreting the experiences of Black people in this country. American society encompasses a variety of systems of cultural definitions, some of which are fundamentally different in nature. When the social cultural content, one must be cautious not to use the framework of experience of one racial cultural group to interpret and explain the experiences of another. And I put that in the introduction, I believe, in the introduction of Black Square and Compass. It is interesting to note that while I have been taken to task concerning my comments about Albert Pike, yet there are those who I have put into the same boat, and there's never any mention of that fact. I did an article on Ku Klux Klans in American Freemasonry, and all hell broke loose in Washington, D.C. From my little article, this little Joe Walks wrote a little article about the Klan and Albert Pike. And people was calling me from all over the world, and they was out there protesting. They dressed the statue of Albert Pike in Klan's clothes, and people was out there demanding that the statue be removed. And I'm telling you, this thing had front page news all over the world, you know. Individual states passed resolutions in their legislature about removing the statue of Albert Pike, all because of Joe Walks. You know, I couldn't believe it. You know, the white Supreme Council got so mad at me, they wanted to strangle me. I thought they was going to send a hit team out after me. You know, so you got to, one article can do your job, you know, but we had some problems there. I talked to Howard Woods, and we decided that they asked us to, my friend Alan Roberts, who's deceased now from Richmond, Virginia, he was a great Masonic author. Many of you know him. He called me and said, Brother Walks, these people out here marching over the statue, and we got to do something here. Can you say something to calm this thing down? And I told him, I said, Brother Roberts, I got to pray over this. Just let me pray over it. And I eventually wrote a letter that they published saying that if the removal of the statue is going to hurt American Freemasonry in any way, let the statue stay. And that's what I wrote, and that's what they published in their journal and in all the newspapers and everything else. And so the statue still sits there. I don't like Albert Pike. And any of you who have been around me in this Philaxis Society over the years know that I do not like Albert Pike, who was considered the founder of Scottish Rite Masonry in America, more or less. Of course, lies are lies, too. And what I'm saying here is that not only did I write about Albert Pike, I wrote about others, and some sovereign grand commanders who were Klansmen. But they don't never mention that. They only focus on Albert Pike, as this letter I'm going to read to you and pass around here. You'll see that. To return back to my favorite writer, when the manuscript division of the Library of Congress, and I use the Library of Congress quite a lot too, by the way, when they received 1,800 manuscript pages, maps, and notes from Kenneth Roberts, it reported that the collection graphically revealed Roberts' devotion to historical accuracy, showing thousands of revisions, corrections, annotations in the author's handwriting. They indicated a meticulous checking of the most minute details. And this is something that I try to do, in my writings. In his book, I Wanted to Write, Roberts explained that in the summer of 1928, he had accumulated, with the help of the Maine State Library and the Library of Congress, the American Antiquarian Society, and a dozen book dealers, a mass of books and diaries, some almost impossible to obtain, from which to excavate the material needed for his outline. And this is what I do, my brothers. I collect documents by the pounds in order to write a book. By the pounds. When I started writing this book, one of the things that I had to come to find out, was, where did blacks get this 33rd degree from? We knew what the blacks said. The blacks said that they got it from whites. Well, okay, that's great. But from who? And that's something I had to uncover. Where did blacks get the 33rd degree? And I was able to do that. I was able to uncover that. And to prove it without a shadow of a doubt, that blacks did get the 33rd degree from authorized Masonic authority. I wrote in the acknowledgement of the history of the Supreme Council that putting together the history of any Masonic organization, especially of Prince Hall, is difficult work. And many people from all over the world are called upon for assistance. Generally, we as people have not done as well as we could in depositing our historical documents and data. And it is very difficult to uncover this material that an historian needs in order to write a history. It is very difficult work to uncover these type documents and requires a determination to dot all of the I's and to cross all of the T's. In the history of the Supreme Council, my first goal was to learn how did blacks receive the Scottish Rite degree. This was truly uncharted waters. The blacks have always said they received the degrees from regular Masonic authority or whites. Therefore, it was up to me to prove once and for all that what they said was true. I had to use Harry E. Davis' writings and go behind him to double-check everything that he wrote on the subject, and yet go even further than that. I had to go to France, to the Grand Orient of France, to learn that, in fact, this is the root of Scottish Rite Freemasonry for Prince Hall. However, it was not until I received a letter, or two letters, written in 1877 by a man by the name of Robert Folger, a very well-known Caucasian writer of early American Scottish Rite. And I received these letters from one of our Flax's fellows, honorary fellows, Dr. S. Brent Morris. Some of you know him, an honorary fellow of the Flax's Society. It was only then did I get the one thing I was looking for. I was looking for that smoking gun. And he sent it to me to show that blacks had actually received their degrees from a man by the name of Saint Laurent. Chapter 2 of the book deals with the Scottish Rite and Saint Laurent, and many aspects concerning him that I was able to uncover through various Masonic libraries in France and the United States. I learned, for instance, that Saint Laurent was a mulatto, and this is probably why he was given the degrees to blacks. When one writes a historical book, especially me, I usually step on someone's toes. For instance, I suspect that there are many Prince Hall Grand Masters who will find the history of the United Supreme Council not to their liking, as I attempted to stress the limitations of their power and authority. Now, they invited me to the Conference of Grand Masters in Baltimore when they held a special meeting down there, and I told the person, Howard Woods, that I didn't want to go because I didn't want to be insulted. I used to attend the Conference of Grand Masters every year, and I told him I didn't want to go because I didn't want to be insulted down there. And he, oh, brother, you got to come. You got to come. You got to represent the Flax's Society. So I went down there, and poor Joe, I got up to ask my statement, and I recommended that the Conference of Grand Masters organize a committee to study and to learn of the limitations of a Grand Master's authority. Well, they didn't like that worth 2 cents. That is very interesting because in this book, I stress that because the Supreme Council has had many problems out of Grand Masters who think that because they're Grand Masters, they have the authority over the United Supreme Council. Well, they don't have authority over nobody. They have no authority. Now, tomorrow, you're going to hear about what took place in Texas with Grand Masters messing with the Order of the Eastern Stars. I think the Grand Master has to pay something like $800,000, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere in that neighborhood for messing with them sisters. All he had to do was leave them sisters alone. That's all he had to do is leave them alone. No, he gonna mess with the Order of the Eastern Stars. The brother's gonna do the workshop here. He was expelled by his Grand Master. And remember, he passed out all these documents here of the case of the Supreme, of Texas, Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Texas, of the Order of the Eastern Stars. And the sisters won that case. And not only that, he appealed it, and they won that too. And I think they got his building. So Grand Masters don't want to hear this, but I stress in this book because every case that the Supreme Council had involving Grand Masters overstepping their authority, I've documented it in this book. And one thing, let me tell you, my brothers, you need to hear this, that Grand Masters get their authority from the lodges and the members of the craft. They get the authority from these brothers to have authority over them. Nowhere in anybody's constitution, in Blue Lodge, are you going to find where anyone has authority over the Order of the Eastern Stars. Because you see, the Order of the Eastern Stars is not a Masonic body. Think about that. So if it's not a Masonic body, does the Grand Master have authority over the Boy Scouts of America? It's like the Caucasians, I'm sorry, Bob, but it's like the Caucasians who claim, remember this, territorial jurisdiction. You heard of that word, right? Territorial jurisdiction. I am the Grand Master of Missouri. I used to tell them, I said, brother, you come on down to black community, and I dare you to come to the black community and tell them that you got authority over there. Yeah, so that's the way it goes. I want to... As I said, I get on a lot of people's toes, and that's the way it is. I know they see me hopping around now. I guess they're happy, you know. I'm going to pass this around, Brother Gonzalez. We take one on one side, and one on the other side, and just pass it. I'm going to pass this letter from the so-called Mother Supreme Council of the World, and it's the portion. Oh, it's the last paragraph there, which I will read for you. That I want you to view. I want you to read just the last paragraph, and I'll read it as you pass the sheet around. It said, and this is concerning this book right here, and then we're going to deal with what he says, and then you tell me your thoughts, okay? And this is a quote. Aside from reviewing your text, I chatted with illustrious S. Brent Morris about it, and we agree it is a fundamental book that fills a gap and will be cited for generations to come. Aha, that sounds great, doesn't it? Doesn't that sound? Okay. As you might imagine, here it comes. I knew it was coming, you know. I personally find your allegations on page 11 and 135 unfortunate, unsubstantiated, and by reliable sources, and not beneficial to Freemasonry generally. Well, okay, so let's take a look at page 11. I'm going to read page 11 and page 12. Let's talk about it. And you tell me why this guy got such a heartburn over page 11 of this book. So I'm going to read portions of it here, page 11, and I'm going to try to read page 12 because it sort of ends there. And this is chapter 2, which is the Scottish Rite. And I started this, and I said here, I write that Davis gives a good tracing of the Scottish Rite in his history of Prince Hall Freemasonry as can be found. Illustrious Robert D. Folger, 33rd degree, does likewise in his classic book, The Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rite in 33 degrees. Folger produces the patent of Stephen Moran. Many of you know who this person is. I found that he too was a mulatto. And I found out what he was doing in the West Indies. He's chasing black women, but I put it in the book too. Folger produces the patent of Stephen Moran and examines his authority. what should be of profound interest to Prince Hall Freemasonry, and here it is the inclusion of the Jewish connection of the Rite. Now, Folger writes this. I'm quoting exactly what he wrote. Brother Moran also appointed Brother Franklin, a Jew, Deputy Inspector General for Jamaica and the British Leeward Islands, and Brother Colonel Provost for the Windward Islands and the British Army. Brother Hayes appointed Isaac D. Costa, a Jew, Deputy Inspector General for the state of South Carolina, who in the year 1783 established the Sublime Grand Lodge of Perfection in Charleston. After Brother DeCosta's death, Brother Joseph Myers, a Jew, was appointed Deputy Inspector General for South Carolina by Brother Hayes, who also had previously appointed Brother Solomon Bush, a Jew, Deputy Inspector General for the state of Pennsylvania, and Brother Bernard M. Spitzer, a Jew, of the same rank in Georgia, end of quote. Now, I write in here, by his writings, Folger seems to have had a problem with Jews, as he lists 10 of 13 professed Jews who were elevated to the high honors in the Scottish Rite. He would later add, and here again, this is Folger speaking, 3 more Jews, which total 13 out of 16. But if history speaks correctly on this subject, this is me, if history speaks correctly on this subject, we have every reason to conclude that Moran and his adjutors, his comrades, in those days found the manufacturing of Masonic degrees and the sale of Masonic dignities a very profitable and lucrative undertaking. Now, Folger also had problems as well with blacks, whom he called niggers. As previously mentioned, what should be a profound interest to Prince Hall Freemasonry is to learn the relationship of these persons and their involvement in the slave trade, and what role Scottish Rite Freemasonry may have played directly or indirectly in this degrading business. Throughout the history, Jews have faced charges of economic exploitation of Gentile communities around the world. Indeed, no single group of people have faced blanket expulsions in so many places around the world as frequently as have the Jews. The pattern and charges are familiar: monopolization, usury, shop practice, selling cheap goods, frequent bankruptcies, and of making profit in the practices of Masonry. Such claims seems to preface the expulsion orders, but are vigorously denied both by those charged and by the Jewish writers of history. This is not the only charge made against Jews. They have been charged as being participants in the entrapment and forcible exportation of millions of black Africans, citizens, into the wretched and inhuman life of bondage for their own selfish financial benefit. Footnote number 27. Footnote number 27 is the key that got me in trouble. The footnote says, "The secret relationship between blacks and Jews." Volume 1. Published in Chicago by the Nation of Islam. Aha. Of the Nation of Islam. It would be interesting to learn exactly what was taking place when Stephen Moran, immediately on his arrival in St. Domingo, appointed a Deputy Inspector General for North America. This high honor was conferred on Moses Michael Hayes, a Jew, who was endowed with powers to appoint others where necessary. Hayes was involved with the British in military supplies, chiefly engaged in the sugar trade and perhaps even the slave trade. An interesting Freemason, he served as master of King David Lodge No. 1 at Newport, Rhode Island, and was later elected a member of Massachusetts Lodge in Boston. In Boston, they have no lodge numbers. He served as a Deputy Inspector General and Grand Master of Massachusetts from 1788 until 1793. Hayes undoubtedly introduced and spread the Rite, and that's the Scottish Rite, in the various states, both in the North and the South. After his death, considerable criticism was directed at him for his Jewish origin and to his designation of other Jews to high offices within Masonry. Purportedly, these persons were heavily involved in the slave trade. Hayes, for instance, initiated and appointed Moses Sextus, a Jew, Sovereign Grand Inspector General for the state of Rhode Island. Let me get this page changed right here. There we go. Moses Sextus was the owner of at least 3 slave ships, the Eagle, the Hiram, and the Union. Sextus had a direct tie to slavery as a slave owner and slave trader. The Eagle, with American and Spanish flags and papers and an American crew, was captured by British cruisers and brought to New York. The United States government declined to interfere with the case, and the ship was later taken to Jamaica. The meeting book of the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania, as recorded on October the 23rd, 1782, lists Benjamin Sextus as the thrice illustrious Prince of Jerusalem. Sextus is reported to have smuggled Africans into the United States after the government ban on the importation of slaves. Prince Hall Freemason Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois noted in his classic 1896 Harvard University Historical Studies, and I quote, "The suppression of the African slave trade to the United States of America, 1638 to 1870, that during all this time scarcely a man suffered for participating in the trade, beyond the loss of the Africans and more rarely of his ship. Red-handed slavers caught in the act and convicted were too often, like DaCosta of South Carolina, the subject of executive clemency." Brother Du Bois would show that the President of the United States, as well as the Congress, would only grant clemency to those who continued to deal in the slave trade after it was illegal to do so. Another of the Scottish Rite members listed in the same minutes mentioned above was Isaac DaCosta, Inspector General for the West Indies and North America, a merchant and shipping agent of Charleston, South Carolina, and probably the most outstanding Jew of Charleston before the Revolution. Born in England, he helped to found the congregation Beth Elohim in 1749 and was its first Hazan, whatever that is. DaCosta was in partnership with Thomas Farr, Jr., handling imports and exports of merchants, including African men and women and children. He was said to be a large-scale hostage importer, and in 1760 brought to South Carolina 200 African people as slaves, and in 1763 brought 160 more. Another Jew, Dr. Jacob D. La Mata, the son of Emmanuel, one of the founders of the so-called Mother Supreme Council at Charleston, South Carolina, received the 33rd degree and became a member of the Supreme Council in 1825. He held as slaves 2 Africans, Anna Marie Simmons and her son Augustus, who were transferred to his sister Rachel after his death. He also held 2 other Africans as slaves, whom he called Sam and Sylvia. A physician who was active in politics, De La Mata served as minister of the Jewish congregation in Savannah and Charleston. He was secretary of the South Carolina Medical Society, assistant commissioner of health, and founder and president of his Orthodox congregation. While this is outside the scope of this work on Prince Hall Freemasonry, nevertheless, its implication must not be ignored, as there seems to be a strong relationship between the early history of white Scottish Rite in North America, the Jews, and the black Holocaust of slavery. Now, my brother, that's what I wrote. What do you think? Tell me, was I wrong? Tell me, brothers, that's why we're here. Tell me about it. Now, I back up everything I say and everything I write. But yet and all, the brother says, where's his letter? He says, read it now. I got it passing there somewhere by you. He says that this is not beneficial to Freemasonry generally. Well, I write for Prince Hall Freemasons, though my book seems to sell. Yeah, my book seems to sell very well among mainstream Freemasons. My brothers, I had to pray over this because it's so easy for us to be accused of being anti-Semitic. I really had to pray over it before I put this down in the book. The Jews are Europeans. They're not Jews per se. They're not the Jews that we used to know. These are European people who call themselves Jews. And they was heavily involved in the slave trade. And some of these were the founders of Scottish Rite Freemasonry in America. And let me say this to you, my brothers. I am a historian. And I try to be worthy of my craft. I footnote everything. If I say A, you can look down on the bottom of the page and you will see who told me I could say A. And then if I say B, you can look down on the bottom of that page and find out who told me to say B. I footnote everything because I am going to be attacked one way or the other. I get it from both. I'm good because I get it from both sides. You know, I get it from both sides. Let's go to the next thing here. And he says, also page 135, unfortunate. So let's take a look at 135 and see what has got my good brother upset here. You know, there's what, 200-something pages in this book, and the only thing he can find to say is these two little items. I got to find out what he's talking about here. I don't know. I can tell you, he probably went to the back here, to the index, and sort certain things out. Yeah, page 135. I have here, and this was, I say Johnson had published in the Proceedings of his Supreme Council a bitterly worded attack on Coles under the title A Brief to the Court of Masonic Public Opinions. Johnson was the white sovereign grand commander of the white northern jurisdiction, and Coles was the sovereign grand commander from the white southern jurisdiction. And Johnson accused Coles of being a dictator. And he wrote that this was a trait inherited from Commander Albert Pike. You see? So I guess my brother, you know, anyway, so I wrote that Johnson's use of the term a trait inherited may be more true than even Commander Johnson realized, as Pike was alleged to have served as Chief Justice of the Ku Klux Klan at the time he was Sovereign Grand Commander. His predecessor, George Fleming Moore, was also alleged to have been involved with the Klan, and for this he was forced to resign his leadership as Sovereign Grand Commander. Coles would be followed by Thomas Hawkins of North Carolina, who penned a bitter attack against Prince Hall Freemasonry. With the ill feelings towards each other, Coles wasted no time in attacking Prince Hall Freemasonry, well aware that Johnson had sided with the blacks. Crawford, who was Sovereign Grand Commander during all this battle between these two white Sovereign Grand Commanders, I mean, you talk about a thriller in Manila with Muhammad Ali and what's his name? George Foreman? Frazier, yeah, Smoking Frazier, Smoking Joe. You thought that was a battle? These two Sovereign Grand Commanders was terrible, man. They was at each other's throats, one in the north, one in the south, and they hated each other. And they was at it. And the thing that they was using was Prince Hall Freemasonry. That's a shame. And I did record it here, a letter if I can find it here real fast, from Brother Crawford, and he accused them. He says, I'll have to tell you what, that he was tired. He stated in so many words that he was tired of these two sovereign grand commanders attacking each other over the shoulders of Prince Hall Freemasonry, and that's what it boiled. So I wrote it. I put all this in the book, you know, because I'm a historian. I don't make history. I record it, you know. Well, how did Joe dig up all this stuff? I'm good. I'll be truthful with you. I'm like a dog, you know. I track it down. I track it down. Whatever it is, I track it down. It doesn't matter where I have to go. I will track it down. And I enjoyed some things that I do right, because I know it's going to come back and they're going to bite me over it. But it's here in the book, my brothers. Albert Pike. I never liked Albert Pike because he was a Confederate general who was a traitor because he was born in Massachusetts, and I call him a traitor. And I have had more problems. I can get the white Southern jurisdiction and I can get along fairly well because we do communicate with each other quite often, many times we communicate, and I always get in trouble when I open my mouth and say Albert Pike was nothing but a racist pig, and they don't like it. Of course, that's their big man. You know, if you go to the temple in Washington D.C., they got this turkey buried right in there. You know, I mean, they got him buried. And Crawford said something in a letter to Coles. He said something about that mausoleum over there on 16th Street. Is something else. I won't say exactly what he said. You'll have to find it in the book. But I put that in there too. So writing history, my brothers, is that's what it's all about. Verify, and uncover facts. You got to be a detective in this writing business. You have to be if you're going to write history. And many of you in this room have written many articles. You know, when you put the final dot at the end of that article, you need to go back again and say, man, can I strengthen this thing any? The documents are there. The documents are there. And you can find them, just like I found them. You know, I don't care. I don't care whoever that person is. If he walked on this earth in America, you can uncover everything that he did. And I got here some sovereign grand commanders on the Prince Hall side who were stealing money. And I put it in there. They stole money. I put it in there, and you know, I didn't steal the money, right? They stole the money, right? And I'm a historian. I'm supposed to report the truth, and that's what I did. But I got some grand masters going to read this thing. It's going, boy, they're going to crucify me. And some of you brothers who have read the books, there's a few here has read it. Ralph McNeil, I put a chapter in the end of this book called Of Mice and Men. And this was about some grand masters who broke off relationship with the Supreme Council of Northern Jurisdiction. And I told it like it was, just the way and the mean-spirited things that they said and did. Like I said, I was invited, for some reason, they invited me down to this summit meeting. They call it the 5th summit meeting that they've had in all of the years the Conference of Grand Masters has been around. They invited me there, and I was sitting there, and I was listening to them attack the sovereign grand commander of the Northern Jurisdiction. And I thought that this was the most un-Masonic thing that I have ever seen or heard. Grand Masters, sitting Grand Masters, attacking the sovereign grand commander in language that was unfit for children to hear. And then, after all these attacks, they asked me to get up and say something. Of course, I told them they needed to check and find out about the authority and the limitations of that authority of a Grand Master. But I also said, guess what, fellas? I'm writing the history of the Supreme Council. And they all shut up and got quiet. It's too late. I had wrote it all down, and it's in the book. So that's the way it goes. My brothers, I have always considered myself, and I'm going to wind down here, I have always considered myself, at least I've tried, to be a credible writer. I have always attempted to verify, verify, verify. You'll hear this word 1,000,000 times out of my mouth. I collect mountains of evidence, just like Kenneth Roberts, before putting anything on paper. I pride myself in the fact that I write in detail every aspect of what I am writing before I put pen to paper. I study everything. Every instant that I can find, I will study it before I put it on paper. I leave very little to chance. I know from past experiences that I must always be ready to defend my work, because there will always be those who will find some objections to what I write. We're making a videotape here, and the brother that sent me this letter, I will send him the videotape. Yes, indeed. Because you see, he can't prove me wrong. However, each reader has a right to their own opinion and may feel free to criticize my work, just as the writer from the White Supreme Council has done. His use of the words "not beneficial to Freemasonry" generally is most interesting. I write as a black man, and I write from the black experience. What might not be beneficial to mainstream Freemasonry may very well be very beneficial to Prince Hall Freemasonry, as my goal in all of my works has always been to educate the craft. The subject of Albert Pike being an allegedly a Klansman is one that the Philaxis Society has dealt with before, to the horror of the white Southern jurisdiction when people was demanding that Albert Pike's statue be torn down. This due in part to an article that I wrote that got international attention. I had people from televisions and radio stations calling me from Washington and all over the place. I mean the big ones too. You know, the Washington Post and all these people talking about, "I got the tape recorder, Lord, you can talk now." Yeah, sure. But anyway, my article did drive people into the streets of Washington, D.C. I don't know whether I'm proud of that or not, but that's the way it is. I well remember that the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Massachusetts in its proceedings wrote that Albert Pike was a traitor and was an evil person, since the white Supreme Council cares less what blacks write and think. It is important that those documents be shared with the craft. In my black square and compass, I wrote, although American Masonry praised Albert Pike, who was one of the most distinguished Masons America has produced, the Negro-phobic Confederate general was the author of Morals and Dogma, often classed as the most profound Masonic work written in the United States. His public utterances justified it being judged as the writings of a hypocritical, prejudiced, racist Mason. His famous statement that he would renounce Masonry rather than recognize Negro Masons as brothers, and his further assertion that by the Convention of Lausanne, the Scottish Rite was saved from the contamination of the leprosy of Negro association. And that's why I write things that I write about Albert Pike. I would like to read to you the comments of Samuel W. Clark, who was a past Grand Master of the Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Ohio at this particular time. And he wrote, "What think you of a man professing to be a Mason uttering such statements as those? God pity Brother Pike and the thousands of canting hypocrites like him." However, as Harry Davis records in his Scottish Rite in the Prince Hall Fraternity, and I quote that, and yet in the face of this, when Pike completed his monumental work on Scottish Rite, he turned over a complete set to illustrious Thurton Jackson, then Sovereign Grand Commander of the Prince Hall Southern Jurisdiction. And this is what he turned over to him. This is unbelievable. He turned over, one, a copy of Morals and Dogma. That was his most famous work. He turned over the 1st to the 3rd degree, the 4th to the 14th degree, the 15th to the 18th degree, the 19th to the 30th degree, the 31st and the 32nd degree. He turned over to him the Grand Constitution of 1762. He turned over to him the Latin Grand Constitutions of 1786 and the Status of the Supreme Council, Southern Jurisdiction, USA, published by authority of the Supreme Council in 1859, and he turned over to Thornton Jackson the 33rd degree. Now, Sovereign Grand Commander John G. Lewis Jr. of Louisiana told me when I raised this thing, because this is the craziest thing I've ever heard of. He said that Thornton Jackson was Albert Pike's barber, and that is why Pike turned over this material to him, which, of course, is clearly one of those curious contradictions so often found in race relations in America. An older generation of Prince Hall Masons are going to have to look and try to figure out what possessed Albert Pike to do this. I don't understand it. If I ever get the opportunity to write the history of the southern jurisdictions, Scottish Rite, I'm going to try to uncover that, to find out exactly what took place. There is a book that just published about the life and times of Albert Pike, and I call it a whitewash, and I wrote all of them, every one of them, including the author, that it was a whitewash because he didn't mention the Klan but one word. He says that it's alleged that he was a Klan, but he was not. He never mentioned Thornton Jackson. He never mentioned giving him all of this documents, this Scottish Rite material. Never mentioned it. And so the book to me is worthless. And I told the author that it was a piece of junk. That's his problem. But here he is, a man who was violently opposed to the recognition of black Masons, still turning over this material to Prince Hall. One of the things that I uncovered at the cathedral was we have always said, the blacks have always said that Pike, that they was using the ritual from Pike. And I wanted to find out what happened to this ritual. Well, we do know, I was able to contact a brother who's a member of, everybody's a member of the Philaxis Society, a Caucasian, who is a ritualist. He studies the ritual. If you open your mouth and say 2 words from a ritual, he can tell you, where that ritual came from, who wrote it. That's what he deals in. That's all he deals with ritual. And he knows ritual. And I contacted him, and he ended up writing a big article in the Scottish Rite Research Transactions about the Scottish Rite ritual in Prince Hall Freemasonry with my help. And he also says that the rituals that was being used in the early days of Prince Hall Scottish Rite came directly from Albert Pike, word for word. He even shows where the whites who published the works made some mistakes in the writing. They made some errors in writing, typographical errors, if you will. And the brothers on the Prince Hall side who didn't know no better, they copied the errors too. But I found out what happened to some of that material, and I put it in this book. The Sovereign Grand Commander of the Southern Jurisdiction, Prince Hall, had this material in his house, and he died. And his wife took the material and threw it in the trash. That's what happened to the Albert Pike handwritten 1st to the 33rd degree in the constitutions. All this was in his hand. And my good brother's wife threw it in the trash can. And so it was lost. And I proved it. I got it in my book. That's one of those mysteries. If I ever get the opportunity to write the history of the Southern Jurisdiction, I'm going to try to uncover this whole thing and find out why Pike did this. Because the man was obviously a racist. My brothers, I believe that the nonfiction book is to inform and educate, to entertain and delight, to arouse emotions, and that's what I like to do, arouse emotions, and to teach and persuade Freemasons to look and to read these non-fiction books on the subject to learn more about what is happening in the fraternity. That no amount of magazines or newspapers or television can give them that. There is a test for all such Masonic books as those that I write. Is the history worth telling? Is it well told? Is it worth reading? I do hope the answers to all of these questions is a resounding yes. Is it worth keeping for one permanent personal library? I have been blessed, my brothers, because over the years I have built my own library, and it's rather massive, and I'm able to sit in my little room and reach and get so many documents at my fingertips, and that really helps me in my work. Let me tell you something. There is no money to be made in writing Masonic books. If you look to retire to California, you ain't going to do it, buddy, because you ain't going to get no money out of Masonic books. It just ain't going to happen. And if you're writing books about Prince Hall Freemasonry, you can get even less, because brothers don't read books too much. That is one of the problems we have with Grand Masters, that they don't read Masonic books. And if you don't read Masonic books, then you don't know anything about Freemasonry. And one of the problems we have, like this brother's going to tell you tomorrow about messing with the sisters of the Order of the Eastern Stars, that Masonic common law alone would keep the Grand Master from making such an idiotic mistake that he made, declaring that he's sovereign over these sisters. And I guess the sisters showed him. Yeah. To conclude, if I was to list what every Masonic writer must know, he must know Freemasonry. He must be able to put on paper his thoughts and care less whose toes he steps on. But more especially, he must be able to defend his work. And my brothers and sisters, I believe that I am more than capable of defending anything that I write, because I just don't sit down and write. Okay? I want to thank all of you for coming and helping me with this workshop. My sir? Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Come on there, Chicago. Who's that? Okay. I do have that work, you know. I do have it. Yeah.
He was dealing with Mackey about it. He'd expended money on making those copies after he resigned with the Spanish. They didn't give him his money back.
They didn't give Pike his money back.
Another thing is that he made that statement. He also made the statement that his father refused
Yeah.
to give him to anybody. You got to realize you're talking about a man who loved books and knowledge. And where was he living? Right in the Supreme Court. All those books, the whole library, had his books.
Yeah, that's true.
It didn't cost him nothing to live there. So he might have said one thing. Don't know.
My brothers, there's a lot of work that needs to be done from the Prince Hall perspective concerning Albert Pike. We know that during the Civil War, he had Indians who slaughtered civilians. And the Supreme Council, the white Supreme Council, will not verify that fact, that this man was a general of Indian troops, and he slaughtered, at least the Indians did, slaughtered and what do they call it, skinning, scalping people. And he was the general in charge. We know also that when the Union troops came to his home, the general was a Mason, and he put Union troops to guard that Masonic library of Albert Pike. Ain't that something? But that's what he did. That's what they did. We also know, too, that during the Civil War, at the same time, blacks of the 54th was holding lodge inside the lines of the Union troops. I put that in black square and compass. There's a lot that we don't know from the Prince Hall perspective, and I have to stress that word, the Prince Hall perspective, about Albert Pike. And somewhere along the line, somebody needs to uncover this thing so we can deal with him once and for all and wash our hands of him. Brother Ralph, of honor for the Phyllis chapter, and he also gave them his Bible, his mother's Bible, and it's over there right now on their altar. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I appreciate it. Thank you, Brother Green. Thank you. Thank you. Think they're gonna wipe me out, huh?
Let them know that. Just sign on either one of them.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm sure you'll appreciate that.